The Texas sun burned like coals over the Whitmore plantation in June 1863. The thick air carried the scent of ripe cotton mixed with the sweat of exhausted bodies laboring beneath the merciless sky. Among the endless rows of white bushes, one woman stood out, not for her height or strength, but for her gaze, a gaze that harbored silent storms, memories branded with iron and fire into her soul. Before we continue with Evelyn's incredible story of resistance and justice, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of courage and survival to light. Now let's dive deeper into Evelyn's world. Evelyn was 32 years old, but she appeared to carry the weight of several lifetimes. Her calloused fingers knew every fiber of that cotton, every thorn that tore skin, every drop of blood spilled on that cursed land. She had been born into slavery on a smaller plantation in Louisiana, sold at age 12 when her first master fell into debt, and resold again at 19 to the Whitmore estate in eastern Texas. 14 years she had endured under the Whitmore family's rule, 14 years of backbreaking labor, humiliation, and a special kind of cruelty that came not from the master himself but from his wife. Margaret Whitmore was a woman of peculiar contradictions. To the outside world, to the neighboring plantation families, and the occasional visitors from Austin or Houston, she presented herself as a model of Southern gentility and Christian virtue. She wore fine dresses imported from New Orleans, hosted tea parties where she discussed literature and the latest fashions, and made generous donations to the local church. Her smile was practiced and perfect, her manners impeccable, her voice always measured and sweet as honeyed tea. But behind the closed doors of the Whitmore estate, Margaret revealed her true nature. She possessed a vindictive streak that ran deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks dotting the property. While her husband Charles managed the business aspects of the plantation with distant efficiency, it was Margaret who oversaw the house slaves with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She took particular interest in matters of discipline, especially when it came to the women under her control. Evelyn had learned this truth within her first month at the Whitmore plantation. A minor infraction, a teacup not placed at precisely the right angle on its saucer, had earned her 10 lashes from the overseer, while Margaret watched from the shade of the big house's veranda, sipping lemonade and commenting on the technique. That was the first time Evelyn saw the whipping tree, a massive live oak that stood about 50 yards from the main house, its thick branches spreading like arms of judgment over a patch of bare earth worn smooth by the feet of countless victims. The tree became a symbol of terror for every slave on the Whitmore property. Its bark bore the scars of rope that had held wrists, its roots had drunk the blood of the punished, and its shade offered no comfort, only the promise of pain. Margaret had personally selected this tree for its visibility. She wanted every slave working in the nearby fields to be able to see what happened to those who displeased her, wanted the screams to carry on the wind as a constant reminder of her authority. Over the years, Evelyn had been brought to that tree more times than she cared to count. 5 lashes for serving dinner 3 minutes late, 15 for a wrinkle in a freshly pressed tablecloth, 20 for daring to meet Margaret's eyes for a second too long. Each punishment was delivered by the overseer, a brutal man named Jeremiah Cobb, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in his work, but always under Margaret's direct supervision. She would stand close enough to see every welt rise on exposed backs, close enough to hear every cry of pain, and her face would remain as serene as if she were observing a pleasant garden party. But what Evelyn endured was nothing compared to the fate of other women who had particularly drawn Margaret's ire. There was Sarah, a young woman barely 20 years old who had the misfortune of being beautiful. Margaret, insecure about her own fading youth and suspicious that her husband might show interest in the attractive slave, had Sarah whipped so severely that the young woman's back became a landscape of permanent scars. Sarah was then sold to a plantation in Mississippi, torn from her mother and younger siblings, sent away as a warning to anyone else who might inadvertently attract unwanted attention. There was also Prudence, an older woman who had served as a midwife among the slave quarters. When Prudence tried to save a young mother and her baby during a difficult birth, a birth that Margaret had insisted continue without adequate rest because the mother had fieldwork quotas to meet, both mother and child died. Margaret blamed Prudence for the loss of valuable property and had her punished with 30 lashes, despite the woman being nearly 60 years old. Prudence survived the whipping but never fully recovered, her spirit broken along with her body. These stories, and dozens more like them, lived in Evelyn's memory like ghosts that refused to be laid to rest. She witnessed Margaret's cruelty, not just toward herself, but toward an entire community of enslaved people who had no recourse, no protection, no hope of justice within a system designed to strip them of their humanity. Every scream that echoed from the whipping tree, every body that limped back to the quarters with fresh wounds, every family separated by Margaret's vindictive whims, all of it accumulated in Evelyn's heart like kindling, waiting for a spark. What made Margaret's cruelty even more unbearable was her ability to justify it through twisted logic and religious rhetoric. She often quoted scripture while ordering punishments, claiming that she was saving souls through discipline, that slavery itself was a divine institution ordained by God, and that her harsh treatment was actually a form of Christian charity designed to civilize inferior beings. She would attend church every Sunday, sing hymns with her clear soprano voice, and return home to order another slave whipped for some trivial offense without seeing any contradiction in her behavior. Charles Whitmore, Margaret's husband, was a different kind of oppressor. He was not actively cruel in the way his wife was. He rarely involved himself in the day-to-day management of the house slaves or the specifics of punishment. His cruelty was more bureaucratic, more efficient, and in some ways more absolute. He viewed the enslaved people on his property purely as economic assets, numbers in a ledger to be maximized for profit. He set impossible work quotas, separated families when it made financial sense, and sold children away from their mothers without hesitation, if the price was right. His distance from the actual violence didn't make him less culpable. It simply meant he could maintain clean hands while others did his dirty work. The Whitmore plantation in 1863 existed in a strange state of tension. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years, and news of battles, victories, and defeats filtered through to eastern Texas in fragments and rumors. The enslaved population heard whispers of liberation, of a president named Lincoln who had issued a proclamation of freedom, of Union armies advancing through the South. But Texas felt far from those battles, insulated by distance and Confederate determination. The Whitmores maintained their lifestyle with stubborn defiance, convinced that the Southern cause would ultimately prevail and that their world of cotton, slavery, and racial hierarchy would endure forever. Evelyn absorbed every scrap of information that reached the plantation. She learned to read in secret, taught by an elderly slave named Moses, who had somehow acquired literacy before being sold to Texas. This was an act of profound rebellion. Slaves caught reading could be maimed or killed, and anyone who taught them faced severe punishment. But Moses believed that knowledge was a form of freedom that couldn't be taken away, and he passed that gift to a select few who he trusted absolutely. Evelyn proved to be a quick study, and within 2 years she could read the occasional newspaper that made its way to the plantation, deciphering the news behind the Confederate propaganda. Through her reading, Evelyn learned about Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia decades earlier, about Harriet Tubman's repeated journeys leading people to freedom, about Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in South Carolina. She learned that resistance was not only possible, but had a long history, that enslaved people throughout the South and throughout history had fought back against their oppression in countless ways, both large and small. These stories became her education in possibility, her proof that the chains binding her body could not chain her spirit or her imagination. In the spring of 1863, something changed in Evelyn. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of abuse. Perhaps it was the growing sense that the world itself was shifting. Or perhaps it was a specific incident that finally pushed her beyond the limits of endurance. That incident occurred on a humid April evening when Margaret, in one of her particularly vindictive moods, decided to punish Evelyn for a crime she didn't commit. A valuable piece of jewelry, a cameo brooch that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, had gone missing from the ladies' dressing room. Margaret immediately accused Evelyn, despite the fact that Evelyn had been working in the kitchen all day under the supervision of the cook, with multiple witnesses who could verify her whereabouts. The truth didn't matter to Margaret. She needed someone to blame, and Evelyn had always been a favorite target. Moreover, Margaret had recently become suspicious that Evelyn was somehow more intelligent than a slave should be, that there was a defiance in her eyes that needed to be broken once and for all. The punishment was set for the following morning at the whipping tree. 25 lashes, a number severe enough to leave permanent scars and serve as a powerful deterrent to the other slaves. That night, as Evelyn lay in the cramped quarters she shared with 6 other women, something crystallized in her mind. She realized that she had reached a point of no return. She could continue to endure, to survive through submission, to hope that somehow freedom would arrive before she was completely broken. Or she could act, knowing that action might mean death, but that death itself might be preferable to perpetual degradation. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky threatening rain but withholding it, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Evelyn was led from the quarters by Jeremiah Cobb, the overseer, his face already showing anticipation of the violence to come. Other slaves were pulled from their work to witness the punishment, as was Margaret's custom. She believed in the pedagogical value of public suffering. They gathered in a reluctant semicircle around the whipping tree, their faces carefully blank, trained through years of survival to show no emotion that might be construed as sympathy or rebellion. Margaret arrived dressed in a pale blue dress that seemed obscene in its frivolity given the occasion. She carried a parasol to protect her complexion from the sun that was beginning to break through the clouds. She positioned herself about 10 feet from the tree, close enough to see everything clearly, but far enough to avoid any blood splatter on her fine clothes. She nodded to Cobb, giving permission for the punishment to begin. Evelyn was brought to the tree, her wrists bound with rough rope, and tied to a low branch that forced her to stand on her toes. Her back was bared, exposed to the eyes of her fellow slaves, and to the whip that Cobb was already testing with practice swings through the air. The sound of leather cutting through the humid morning was sharp and terrible, a promise of pain to come. But as Cobb drew back his arm for the first strike, something extraordinary happened. Evelyn turned her head as far as the ropes would allow and looked directly at Margaret, not with the downcast eyes of a submissive slave, not with the blank stare of someone trying to endure, but with a gaze of such intensity, such burning consciousness and accusation, that Margaret actually took a step backward. In that moment, Evelyn spoke. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the assembled slaves to Margaret's ears with perfect clarity. She said only 4 words, but they were 4 words that would change everything. God sees your sin. The silence that followed Evelyn's words was absolute and suffocating. Even the birds seemed to stop their morning songs, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of what had just been spoken. Margaret's face went through a series of transformations. Shock, then fury, then something else, something harder to define. Fear, perhaps, or the uncomfortable stirring of a conscience she had long ago buried beneath layers of privilege and self-justification. Jeremiah Cobb stood frozen, with his whip raised, unsure whether to proceed. He looked to Margaret for guidance, but the plantation mistress seemed momentarily paralyzed, her parasol trembling slightly in her grip. The assembled slaves maintained their carefully neutral expressions, but something electric passed through the group, a shared recognition that a line had been crossed, that the unspoken rules governing their interactions with their oppressors had just been violated in the most fundamental way. Margaret recovered herself with visible effort, her face hardening into a mask of rage. 25 lashes, she said, her voice tight and controlled, despite the fury underneath. No, make it 40. This slave needs to learn that silence is a virtue, and that presuming to speak the word of God is the gravest blasphemy when it comes from such a mouth. Cobb nodded and brought the whip down with practiced brutality. The leather struck Evelyn's back with a sound like a gunshot, and a line of fire opened across her skin. She gasped, but did not scream. The second lash followed, then the third, each one adding another stripe of agony to her back. But even as the pain mounted, even as blood began to flow and soak into the waistband of her rough cotton dress, Evelyn did not beg for mercy. She did not apologize. She simply endured, her body absorbing the punishment while her mind traveled somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of the whip. By the 20th lash, Cobb was sweating from the exertion. By the 30th, some of the watching slaves had tears streaming down their faces, though they dared not make a sound. By the 40th, Evelyn's back was a landscape of torn flesh and welling blood, and she had finally lost consciousness, her body hanging limply from the ropes that bound her wrists to the tree. Margaret watched every lash with an expression that was difficult to read. There was satisfaction there, certainly, the grim pleasure of power exercised without restraint, but there was also something else, something that looked almost like unease. Evelyn's 4 words had burrowed into her mind like splinters, and she couldn't quite extract them. God sees your sin. The phrase echoed in her thoughts even as she watched the physical punishment unfold, creating a dissonance she couldn't entirely dismiss. When the whipping finally ended, Cobb cut Evelyn down from the tree, and 2 of the women slaves carried her limp body back to the quarters. Margaret dispersed the gathered slaves with sharp orders to return to their work. then retreated to the big house where she spent the rest of the morning in her sitting room, claiming a headache. She tried to read, tried to occupy herself with correspondence, but found her attention wandering. The day felt somehow off-kilter, as if the natural order of things had been subtly disrupted. In the slave quarters, the women tended to Evelyn with the practiced skill of people who had nursed many whipping wounds. They cleaned her shredded back with water and what little precious salt they had to prevent infection, applied poultices made from herbs that Moses had taught them to gather from the woods surrounding the plantation, and wrapped her in clean rags. Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, her body fighting fever and infection, her mind wandering through landscapes of memory and dream. During those 3 days of delirium, Evelyn traveled back through her life. She remembered her mother, whose name had been Ruth, sold away when Evelyn was only 7 years old. She remembered her mother's last words to her, "Remember who you are. They can take everything from us, but they cannot take who we are unless we let them." She remembered the day she was first sold, standing on an auction block in New Orleans, while white men examined her teeth and muscles as if she were livestock. She remembered the various plantations she had passed through, each one a circle of hell with its own particular torments, but she also remembered moments of beauty and resistance. She remembered the songs sung in the quarters after dark, songs that spoke in coded language of freedom and deliverance, of crossing rivers to promised lands. She remembered the secret gatherings in the woods where enslaved people from neighboring plantations would meet to share news, to worship in their own way, to marry and celebrate births without white oversight. She remembered learning to read, the way the letters had transformed from mysterious symbols into gateways of knowledge and power. Most importantly, during those fever dreams, something solidified in Evelyn's spirit. The whipping had not broken her, it had clarified her. She emerged from her delirium with a strange calm, a certainty that had not been there before. She knew, with the kind of knowledge that comes from somewhere deeper than rational thought, that she would not die as a slave. She would either die in the act of resistance, or she would live to see freedom, but she would never again submit to Margaret Whitmore's cruelty without fighting back. On the 4th day after her whipping, Evelyn was able to sit up and take some broth. Moses came to visit her, his ancient face creased with concern and something else, a kind of recognition. He sat beside her pallet and spoke in the low voice they used for dangerous conversations, words that could not be overheard or repeated. "You know what you did, don't you?" he said, not quite asking. "You broke the spell of fear. Every slave on this plantation heard what you said to Miss Margaret, and they heard it in your voice, not begging, not afraid, but speaking truth to power. That's a dangerous thing, child. Dangerous and precious." Evelyn nodded slowly, her back still radiating pain with every movement. "I know," she said. "I can't go back to how things were before." "I won't." Moses studied her for a long moment. "There's talk," he said carefully. "Talk that's been growing louder these past months. The war isn't going well for the Confederacy, no matter what the newspapers say. The Union is pushing deeper into the South. Texas might be far from the main fighting, but change is coming one way or another. Question is, do we wait for it or do we help it along?" This was as close to open rebellion as Moses had ever come in Evelyn's hearing. The old man was cautious by nature, having survived 7 decades of slavery through a combination of intelligence, discretion, and the careful management of white expectations. If he was speaking such words aloud, it meant he sensed that the moment for caution might be passing. "What are you saying, Moses?" Evelyn asked, though she thought she already knew. "I'm saying that there's folks on this plantation, and on the neighboring plantations too, who are tired of waiting, tired of hoping that Lincoln's proclamation will somehow reach Texas, tired of praying that the Union Army will arrive before we're all worked to death or sold to someplace even worse. There's been meetings in the woods at night, plans being made, nothing certain yet but possibilities taking shape." Evelyn felt her heart quicken despite the pain in her back. "What kind of plans?" Moses leaned even closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Plans to run. Not just 1 or 2 people trying to make it north, but a large group, maybe 30, 40 people from 3 different plantations, all moving together. There's been contact made with people who know the routes, who can guide us toward the Union lines. It's dangerous, maybe more dangerous than staying, but some folks think it's worth the risk." "When?" Evelyn asked. "Not yet. Could be weeks, could be months. We need more information about troop movements, need to wait for the right time when confusion and opportunity align. But when it happens, you should know about it. You should have the choice." Evelyn nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The The idea of escape, of actually running toward freedom rather than simply enduring slavery and hoping for eventual liberation, ignited something in her chest. But she also thought about Margaret Whitmore, about the whipping tree, about all the accumulated cruelty and injustice that she had witnessed and experienced. A part of her, a part that frightened her with its intensity, wanted something more than escape. It wanted justice. It wanted the balance of power to shift, even if only for a moment, even if only in one small way. Over the following weeks, as Evelyn's back slowly healed, leaving a network of raised scars that would mark her for the rest of her life, she returned to her duties in the big house. Margaret treated her with renewed coldness, piling on extra work and watching for any sign of further insubordination. But Evelyn had learned to school her features into perfect submission, while her mind worked on entirely different problems. She began to observe the plantation's rhythms with new attention. She noted when Cobb made his rounds of the property, when Charles Whitmore traveled to neighboring plantations or into the nearby town for business, when Margaret was most likely to be alone in the house. She memorized the locations of keys, the schedules of the other house slaves, the patterns of daily life that governed the Whitmore estate. She did all of this without a specific plan, simply gathering information like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter, knowing that knowledge itself was a form of power. In late May, an event occurred that would prove catalytic. Charles Whitmore received word that his brother had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. He would need to travel to oversee family affairs and the disposition of his brother's estate, a journey that would take him away from the plantation for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Margaret would be left in charge with only Cobb and the house slaves for company and security. The night before Charles's departure, Evelyn overheard an argument between the married couple. She was supposed to be in the kitchen preparing their dinner, but the raised voices carried clearly through the thin walls of the big house. Charles was expressing concern about leaving Margaret alone with only an overseer for protection, suggesting that perhaps she should go stay with relatives in Houston until his return. Margaret refused absolutely, insisting that she was perfectly capable of managing the plantation in his absence, that she would not be driven from her own home by fear or inconvenience. "The slaves are cowed," she said with utter confidence. "That whipping I gave to Evelyn in April set the right tone. There hasn't been a whisper of trouble since then. You worry too much, Charles. Go and do what needs to be done. The plantation will be exactly as you left it when you return." Charles departed the next morning, and the plantation settled into a new rhythm under Margaret's sole authority. If anything, she became even more imperious, even more quick to find fault and assign punishment. It was as if she felt the need to prove her capability, to demonstrate that a woman could rule a plantation as effectively as any man. She drove the field slaves harder, extended their working hours, and reduced their already meager rations as punishment for minor infractions. But while Margaret focused on exerting control, she failed to notice the subtle changes in atmosphere. The slaves had become quieter, more inward, communicating through glances and small gestures rather than words. Moses's secret meetings in the woods grew more frequent. Information flowed through invisible channels, passed from plantation to plantation by people who moved between properties as hired labor or on errands for their masters. The network of resistance was expanding, becoming more organized, and the date for the planned escape was being moved up. In mid-June, on a night when the moon was dark and the air thick with the promise of rain, Moses came to Evelyn with news. The escape would happen in 10 days, on a night when several factors would align favorably. A moonless night, a planned gathering at a neighboring plantation that would distract attention and intelligence about Confederate troop movements that suggested a temporary gap in local security. Approximately 40 people would attempt to run together, moving quickly toward the north where Union forces were believed to be advancing into Arkansas. "You need to decide now," Moses told her. "Once we go, there's no turning back, and anyone who stays behind will face questions, will be suspected of knowing about the plan. It's not safe to wait and see." Evelyn felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Escape meant risking everything. If they were caught, the punishment would be death or worse. But staying meant continuing to live under Margaret's cruelty, meant accepting a life of servitude that might last years longer, even if the Union eventually won the war. She thought about her mother, sold away so many years ago, and wondered if Ruth had ever had a chance to run, to choose freedom over safety. But as she contemplated the escape plan, another idea began to form in Evelyn's mind, an idea that was dangerous, possibly insane, but which answered something deep in her soul that had been awakened by Margaret's years of cruelty. She thought about the whipping tree, about the 40 lashes she had endured, about Sarah and Prudence and all the other women who had suffered under Margaret's vindictive authority. She thought about Margaret's absolute conviction in her own superiority, her unwavering belief that she had the right to inflict pain without consequence. "I'll go with you," Evelyn told Moses, "but I have something I need to do first, something that needs to happen before I leave this place." Moses looked at her with concern and understanding in equal measure. "What are you planning, child?" Evelyn met his eyes steadily. "Justice," she said simply. "Just one small piece of justice before we run toward freedom." The days leading up to the planned escape were charged with a tension that only those involved could feel. To Margaret Whitmore and Jeremiah Cobb, the plantation appeared to be running smoothly, perhaps even more efficiently than usual. The slaves worked without complaint, kept their eyes downcast and performed their duties with mechanical precision. But beneath this surface of compliance, an entirely different reality was taking shape, plans being finalized, supplies being secretly gathered, routes being memorized, and courage being summoned for the perilous journey ahead. Evelyn moved through her duties in the big house with particular care during this time. She served Margaret's meals, cleaned her rooms, pressed her dresses, and maintained the perfect facade of submission that had been demanded of her for 14 years. But every action was now performed with heightened awareness. Every moment spent in Margaret's presence used to gather final pieces of information that might prove useful. She noted that Margaret had taken to keeping a small pistol in the drawer of her nightstand, a precaution against the possibility of slave rebellion that she considered unlikely but not impossible. She observed that Margaret slept poorly, often waking in the night and lighting lamps to read or write letters. The plantation mistress seemed to feel the absence of her husband more than she cared to admit. Without Charles there to provide even his distant bureaucratic form of authority, Margaret found herself truly alone in her power. She wrote long letters to relatives, attended church services with increased frequency, and filled her days with activities designed to assert her control and stave off the isolation that came with commanding a plantation in wartime. She was, in her own way, as trapped by the system of slavery as those she enslaved, though her cage was gilded and came with the power to inflict suffering on others. On the afternoon of June 24th, 3 days before the planned escape, Evelyn was cleaning Margaret's bedroom when she found something that would prove instrumental to her plan. Tucked into a small jewelry box on Margaret's vanity was a key that Evelyn had never seen before. It was larger than the keys for the various rooms and cabinets in the house, made of heavy iron, and it took her a moment to realize what it might unlock. The chains. The punishment chains that Cobb kept in a storage building near the whipping tree, used occasionally when Margaret wanted someone restrained for extended periods as additional humiliation. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she looked at the key. She had not fully formed her plan until this moment, had only known that she wanted to confront Margaret before leaving, wanted somehow to make the plantation mistress understand what her cruelty had wrought. But seeing this key, an idea crystallized with sudden clarity. It was audacious and terrifying, almost certainly doomed to failure, but it called to something in Evelyn's spirit that would not be denied. She palmed the key with the practiced subtlety of someone who had learned to move invisibly through a world that watched her constantly. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron and continued her cleaning as if nothing had happened. That evening, she made a wax impression of the key using a technique Moses had taught her years ago, a survival skill that enslaved people passed down through networks of knowledge. The next morning, while Margaret was at church, Evelyn gave the key to Moses along with the wax impression. "Can you make a copy?" she asked. "And can you do it without anyone knowing?" Moses examined the impression carefully. "It'll take a day, maybe 2. There's a man on the Henderson plantation who knows metalwork, who can cast this quietly. But Evelyn, what are you planning? This is the kind of thing that gets people killed." "I know," Evelyn said, "but some things matter more than safety. Some things need to happen, regardless of the risk." Moses studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll have it made. But you be careful, child. There's a difference between bravery and foolishness, and the line between them is thinner than most people think." 2 days later, on the evening of June 26th, the night before the planned escape, Moses delivered the copied key to Evelyn. It wasn't perfect, but it would serve its purpose. Along with the key, he brought final instructions for the escape. The group would gather at midnight in the woods beyond the eastern cotton fields, a location far enough from the slave quarters to avoid immediate detection. From there, they would move quickly through a series of planned stops, using safe houses and hidden routes that had been scouted in advance. The first 24 hours would be the most dangerous. But if they could get beyond the immediate area of the plantations, their chances improved significantly. "You're still planning to come with us?" Moses asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer was more complicated than a simple yes. "I'll be there," Evelyn said, "but I'll be coming last. There's something I have to do first, and it might take some time. Don't wait for me if I'm not there when the group needs to move. I'll catch up if I can." Moses wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that whatever she was planning wasn't worth the risk, but he had known Evelyn long enough to recognize the futility of such arguments. Instead, he simply embraced her, a rare gesture in a world where physical affection between enslaved people was often punished if observed by whites. "Whatever you're going to do," he said quietly, "do it quickly and get out. Freedom won't mean anything if you're dead." That night, Evelyn could not sleep. She lay on her pallet in the quarters, listening to the breathing of the other women around her, thinking about what the next day would bring. She was not afraid exactly. Fear seemed too simple an emotion for what she felt. It was more a kind of crystalline clarity, a sense that she was moving towards something inevitable, something that had been building for 14 years and could no longer be denied. The next day, June 27, 1863, began like any other day on the Whitmore plantation. The sun rose hot and bright, promising another scorching afternoon. The field slaves rose before dawn and moved out to the cotton rows, while Evelyn and the other house slaves began their daily routines. Margaret came down for breakfast at 8 o'clock, as was her custom, and Evelyn served her coffee and biscuits with perfect, practiced efficiency. But this morning, Evelyn had added something to Margaret's coffee, a preparation that Moses had given her, made from roots and herbs that grew in the deep woods, known to enslaved healers for its ability to induce deep sleep without causing permanent harm. It was a mercy. In a way, what Evelyn planned to do would be easier if Margaret was not fully conscious for the initial stages. Margaret finished her breakfast and retired to her sitting room with correspondence to attend to. Within 30 minutes, she was feeling drowsy, attributing it to the heat and her continued poor sleep. She lay down on the settee in her sitting room, intending to rest for just a few minutes. Within 10 minutes, she was deeply asleep, her breathing slow and regular, her body completely relaxed. Evelyn watched from the doorway for a moment, then moved with swift purpose. She recruited 2 of the other house slaves, women named Clara and Ruth, who had suffered their own share of Margaret's cruelty and who had already agreed to join the escape that night. Together, the 3 women carried Margaret's unconscious body out of the house, moving quickly across the grounds toward the storage building near the whipping tree. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story gripping and want to see more historical narratives like this, please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. Now, let's return to this pivotal moment. The storage building was unlocked, and inside they found the chains that Cobb used for punishment, heavy iron shackles connected by thick links. Working together, the 3 women secured Margaret to the central post of the building, her wrists bound above her head in a position eerily similar to how countless slaves had been bound at the whipping tree. They did not hurt her, did not strike her or abuse her while she was unconscious. This was about something different than mere revenge. Once Margaret was secured, Evelyn sent Clara and Ruth back to the house with instructions to continue their normal duties, as if nothing had happened. If anyone asked about Margaret, they were to say she was resting and did not want to be disturbed. Cobb was overseeing work in the far fields and wouldn't return until evening. This gave Evelyn a window of several hours to do what needed to be done. She sat in the storage building and waited for Margaret to wake up. It took about 2 hours. When Margaret finally stirred and opened her eyes, her first reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then rapidly mounting panic as she realized her situation. She was chained in her own storage building, her wrists raw against the iron shackles, her expensive dress already soiled from contact with the dirty floor. "Evelyn?" Margaret's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "What is the meaning of this? Release me immediately. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you for this? They'll hang you. They'll make an example that will be remembered for generations." Evelyn stood slowly from where she had been sitting and walked to stand directly in front of Margaret. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Do you remember what you said when you had me whipped for the stolen brooch? The brooch that turned up a week later in your own jewelry box, exactly where you had misplaced it? You said I needed to learn my place. You said the whipping would be educational." Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: fury, confusion, and beneath it all, the first stirrings of genuine fear. "This is madness! You cannot possibly think you'll get away with this. When Charles returns—" "Charles won't return for weeks if he returns at all," Evelyn interrupted. "The war is not going well for your Confederacy, no matter what the newspapers say. The world you've built your life on is crumbling, Margaret Whitmore. You just haven't realized it yet." "I will see you dead for this," Margaret hissed, "slowly and painfully dead. You and everyone who helped you." Evelyn reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out something that made Margaret's eyes widen with recognition and horror. The whip that Cobb used at the tree, the same whip that had torn Evelyn's back open 3 months earlier. Evelyn had taken it from Cobb's quarters earlier that morning, knowing he wouldn't miss it until evening. "For 14 years, Evelyn said quietly, "I have watched you inflict suffering on people who had no power to stop you, no recourse to justice, no hope of anyone holding you accountable for your cruelty. You beat Sarah so badly, her back will be scarred for life, then sold her away from her family. You had Prudence whipped until she couldn't stand, an old woman who had done nothing but try to save a life. You've separated children from their mothers, husbands from wives, all without a second thought because you believed you had the right, because you believed we weren't fully human, weren't deserving of the basic dignity you would accord to an animal." Margaret was shaking now, her aristocratic composure finally cracking. "Please," she said, and it was perhaps the first time she had ever spoken that word to a slave as anything other than a command. "Please, don't do this. I'll give you money. I'll write you freedom papers. You'll give me nothing," Evelyn said, "because you have nothing that I want except one thing: justice. Just a small measure of justice before I leave this place forever." She raised the whip, and Margaret screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the storage building. But Evelyn did not strike. Instead, she lowered the whip and looked at Margaret with an expression that was harder to read than fury or hatred. It was something closer to pity. "I'm not going to whip you to death," Evelyn said. "I'm not even going to whip you as many times as you've had me whipped. I'm going to give you exactly 10 lashes, one for every year I've been on this plantation, and then I'm going to leave you here, alive, so you can think about what it feels like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy, to know that your pain means nothing to the person inflicting it." The first lash fell with the same terrible crack that Evelyn had heard so many times before, but from the other side of the whip. The leather struck Margaret's back through the fine fabric of her dress, and the plantation mistress screamed, a sound of shock and pain that seemed to echo off the wooden walls of the storage building. Evelyn felt the weight of the whip in her hand, felt the resistance as it connected with flesh, and something complex moved through her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of cosmic balance being momentarily restored. She counted aloud as she delivered each lash, her voice steady. 2, 3, 4. Each number marked not just a strike of the whip, but a memory, a specific instance of cruelty that Margaret had inflicted, a face of someone who had suffered under her authority. With the 5th lash, Evelyn thought of Sarah, sold away and lost. With the 6th, she thought of Prudence, broken by a whipping she didn't deserve. With the 7th, she remembered her own mother, Ruth, torn from her arms by a system that Margaret enthusiastically supported and benefited from. Margaret's screams evolved into sobbing pleas between lashes. "Stop! Please, stop! I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" The words tumbled out in a desperate cascade, perhaps the first genuine apology she had ever offered to an enslaved person. But Evelyn did not stop until she reached 10, the number she had promised. The final lash fell, and then Evelyn lowered the whip, her arm trembling slightly from exertion and emotion. Margaret hung in her chains, her dress torn and bloodied, her face streaked with tears and snot, her aristocratic composure completely shattered. She looked nothing like the imperious plantation mistress who had ruled over the Whitmore estate with such absolute conviction in her own superiority. She looked instead like what she actually was, a human being experiencing pain and terror, stripped of the social constructs that had protected her and elevated her above others. Evelyn stood before her for a long moment, breathing heavily, the whip still in her hand. She felt many things in that moment. A grim satisfaction, yes, but also a kind of sadness. The whipping had not changed anything fundamental about the world. It had not freed the other slaves still laboring in the cotton fields. It had not brought back those who had been sold away or killed. It had not undone 14 years of cruelty. It was simply one small act of resistance, one reversal of power dynamics that would be remembered by those who witnessed it, but would not alter the larger structures of oppression. "Do you understand now?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Do you understand what it feels like? This is a fraction of what you've inflicted on others, Margaret Whitmore. 10 lashes compared to the hundreds and hundreds you've ordered over the years. 10 lashes compared to the lifetimes of suffering you've caused." Margaret could only sob in response, her body shaking with pain and shock. Evelyn set the whip down on the ground and took a step closer to the woman who had tormented her for so long. "I want you to remember this feeling," Evelyn said, her voice low and intense. "I want you to remember it every day for the rest of your life. Remember what it's like to be powerless. Remember what it's like to have someone else control whether you feel pain or relief, whether you live or die. Remember that we are human beings, Margaret. Every single one of us that you've beaten and sold and degraded. We are human beings with the same capacity to suffer that you have." She turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped her. "You'll never make it," Margaret said, her words thick with pain but still carrying an edge of venom. "They'll hunt you down like dogs. Cobb will organize a pursuit, and they'll bring you back in chains. And when they do, I'll make sure your death is so slow and agonizing that you'll beg for the mercy of a simple whipping." Evelyn looked back over her shoulder at the broken woman chained to the post. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe we won't make it. Maybe freedom is still years away, or maybe it will never come at all. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have chosen to run toward hope rather than stay still in despair. What will you have, Margaret? What will you have when this war ends and your entire world collapses around you? You'll have memories of cruelty and the knowledge that you used your power for nothing but causing pain." She walked out of the storage building without looking back, leaving Margaret chained and sobbing in the dim interior. Outside, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead, and the plantation was eerily quiet. Most of the field slaves were still working in the distant cotton rows, too far away to have heard Margaret's screams. The house slaves who knew what was happening had been instructed to stay inside the big house and maintain the fiction that everything was normal. Evelyn went to the slave quarters and gathered the few possessions she owned: a spare dress, a small cloth bag containing a piece of bread and some dried meat, the letters that Moses had taught her to read, and a small wooden carving that her mother had made for her before being sold away. Everything she owned in the world fit into a bundle that could be carried in one hand. 14 years of her life reduced to objects that could be held in a single cloth sack. She changed out of her house slave dress into the rougher clothing of a field worker, which would be more practical for traveling. Then she went to find Moses, who was waiting for her near the edge of the quarters. "Is it done?" he asked simply. "It's done," Evelyn confirmed. "Margaret is secured in the storage building. I left her alive, as I said I would. She'll be found eventually. Cobb will start looking for her when she doesn't appear for supper, and someone will hear her screaming. But by then we should have several hours head start." Moses nodded slowly. "The others are already gathering. Everyone who's coming is ready. We need to leave within the hour if we're going to put enough distance between us and pursuit." They walked together toward the meeting point, moving through the familiar landscape of the plantation that had been both home and prison for so many years. Evelyn found herself looking at everything with new eyes, knowing she would never see it again. The rows of cotton plants, the big house sitting white and imposing on its small hill, the whipping tree with its spreading branches, all of it would soon be part of her past rather than her present. The group that had gathered in the woods beyond the eastern fields was larger than Evelyn had expected. She counted 37 people, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly folks like Moses. They carried few possessions, traveling light for speed. Among them were entire families who had made the decision to risk everything together rather than be separated, couples who held hands with quiet determination, and individuals who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. There were field workers with backs scarred from countless whippings, house slaves who had lived in closer proximity to their oppressors and understood exactly how fragile and human those oppressors truly were, skilled craftsmen who had watched their labor enrich others while they remained in bondage, and women who had endured sexual violence and the theft of their children. Each person there had their own story of suffering and survival, their own reasons for choosing the dangerous path of escape over continued enslavement. Among the group, Evelyn recognized Clara and Ruth from the big house, both of whom had helped her with Margaret. There was also a young man named Samuel, who worked in the fields and who had been separated from his wife when she was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. There was an older woman named Dinah, who had been a midwife and healer, whose knowledge of herbs and medicine would prove invaluable on their journey. There was Marcus, a blacksmith whose skills had made him valuable enough to avoid the worst punishments, but who had finally decided that even privileged slavery was still slavery. The escape was organized with remarkable efficiency, the result of weeks of careful planning. They had guides, 2 men who had made the journey north before and been recaptured, but who had memorized the routes and knew which areas to avoid. They had a rough map sketched from descriptions provided by free black people who had sent messages south through underground networks. They had passwords that would identify them to potential helpers along the way, and they had a plan for how to move through hostile territory with minimal detection. As night fell and the group prepared to move out, Moses gathered everyone for a brief moment of prayer and encouragement. He spoke in the coded language of spirituals and biblical references that enslaved people had used for generations to speak of freedom and resistance without alerting white listeners. "We're crossing Jordan tonight," he said, using the metaphor that had long represented escape to freedom. "The river is deep and the current is strong, but there's a promised land on the other side. Some of us might not make it across. Some of us might be pulled under by the waters, but those who reach the other shore will be free, and they'll remember those who tried." There were murmured amens and quiet affirmations from the gathered group. Then, as the last light faded from the sky and darkness settled over the plantation, they began to move. They traveled in small clusters rather than one large group, spacing themselves out to avoid drawing attention. The first cluster moved out, disappearing into the woods, followed by the second, then the third. Evelyn was in one of the last clusters to leave, along with Moses, Clara, Ruth, and 3 others. As they moved through the darkening woods, she could hear the sounds of the plantation fading behind her, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the barking of dogs. Ahead lay unknown territory, danger and possibility in equal measure. They traveled through the night, moving as quickly as the terrain and the slowest members of the group would allow. They crossed streams by feeling for stones in the darkness, pushed through underbrush that tore at their clothing and skin, and navigated by the stars and the guidance of those who knew the route. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness: the snap of a twig, the call of a night bird, the rustle of some animal in the brush, and each one could be a sign of pursuit or simply the normal sounds of a forest at night. As dawn approached, they had covered approximately 15 miles from the Whitmore plantation. They were tired, their feet were bleeding from the rough travel, and they knew that pursuit would begin in earnest once Margaret was discovered. But they had made it through the first night, and that was something. They found a hidden ravine where they could rest during the day, posting guards to watch for any sign of pursuers, while the rest tried to sleep. Evelyn found it difficult to rest despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to the image of Margaret chained in the storage building, to the feel of the whip in her hand, to the screams that had echoed off the wooden walls. She wondered if she had done the right thing. If that act of resistance had been worth the risk it posed not just to herself, but to everyone who was escaping with her. She wondered if Margaret had been found yet, if Cobb was already organizing a pursuit party, if dogs were being brought in to track their scent. Moses, who was resting nearby, seemed to sense her troubled thoughts. He moved closer and spoke in a low voice. "You questioning what you did back there?" "Not questioning," Evelyn said. "Just thinking about it, wondering what it means, what it changes." "It changes what it changes," Moses said with the oblique wisdom he often employed. "Maybe it don't change the big world, but it changed something in you. And maybe it changed something in Margaret Whitmore too, though whether that change takes root or withers away, only time will tell. But I'll say this, every slave who heard about what you did, every person who's running with us tonight, they'll carry that story. They'll know that someone stood up, that someone made their oppressor feel even a fraction of what we've felt. That matters." "Does it matter enough to justify putting everyone at risk?" Evelyn asked. Moses considered this. "You didn't force anyone to run. Everyone here made their own choice. Some chose to run because the war is creating opportunities. Some chose to run because they couldn't stand another day in bondage, and some chose to run because they heard about a woman who stood up to her mistress and lived to tell the tale. Your action gave people hope, Evelyn. Hope is a dangerous thing, but it's also the thing that keeps us human." They rested through the day, taking turns sleeping and keeping watch. As the sun climbed higher, they could hear distant sounds that might have been dogs, might have been pursuit, or might have been nothing but their own fear making them hear threats in every noise. By mid-afternoon, they had to make a decision: continue resting and risk being caught, or move out earlier than planned and risk being spotted in daylight. The guides made the call to move. They would travel through terrain that was heavily wooded enough to provide cover even in daylight, and the risk of staying in one place was becoming greater than the risk of moving. The group roused themselves, gathered their few possessions, and continued their journey north. The second day of travel was harder than the first in almost every way. Exhaustion weighed on the group like a physical burden, their bodies unaccustomed to the sustained exertion of constant movement. Feet that were bleeding the night before were now infected and swollen. Hunger gnawed at empty stomachs, as the small amount of food they had been able to bring was already running low, and hovering over everything was the constant fear of pursuit. The knowledge that every hour they traveled brought them closer to freedom, but also deeper into territory, where recapture might mean death rather than a return to bondage. They moved through pine forests and across open meadows, always choosing the path that offered the most cover. They waded through streams to throw off dogs that might be tracking their scent. They avoided roads and settlements, giving wide berth to any place where white people might spot them and raise an alarm. The guides led them with remarkable skill, using landmarks and natural features that seemed meaningless to untrained eyes, but which told them exactly where they were and which direction to travel. By the afternoon of the second day, they encountered their first real obstacle. They had reached a river that was wider and deeper than expected, swollen by recent rains. The guides had known they would need to cross water, but they had hoped to find a shallow ford. Instead, they were faced with a swift current that looked treacherous, perhaps even deadly to those who couldn't swim, and many in the group had never had the opportunity to learn. A quick conference was held among the guides and the strongest members of the group. They decided to cross at a point where the river narrowed slightly between two large rocks. Those who could swim would go first, carrying ropes that could be secured on the far bank. Then they would create a human chain to help non-swimmers across, holding tight to the ropes to avoid being swept away by the current. The crossing took nearly 2 hours and almost ended in disaster multiple times. An elderly man named Joseph lost his footing and was pulled under, only saved by Marcus the blacksmith, who dove in and pulled him to the surface. A young woman named Hannah was swept downstream and barely managed to catch hold of a rock, where she clung terrified until rescuers could reach her. But eventually, miraculously, all 37 people made it across, soaked and shivering, but alive. On the far bank of the river, they allowed themselves a brief rest. Evelyn sat with her back against a tree, wringing water from her dress and trying to warm herself in the late afternoon sun. She looked at the faces around her, people who had risked everything, who had left behind the only homes they had known, who had chosen the terrifying uncertainty of freedom over the predictable horror of slavery. She felt a fierce pride in them and in herself, mixed with an overwhelming sense of responsibility for what they had set in motion. As night fell again, they continued moving. The guides estimated they had covered nearly 40 miles from the Whitmore plantation, putting significant distance between themselves and immediate pursuit, but they also knew that word would have spread by now, that slave catchers might have been hired, that the full apparatus of the slave-owning society would be mobilized to recapture them. They were valuable property, and property owners did not give up their possessions easily. On the third day of travel, they received their first confirmation that they were being pursued. One of the scouts, a young man named Isaiah, who had been sent ahead to check the route, returned with urgent news. A group of mounted men, at least 8 of them, were moving through the area behind the escapees, clearly searching. They had dogs with them, and they were checking every possible hiding place, every patch of woods, every ravine. The group made an immediate decision to split up. 37 people moving together left too obvious a trail, made too much noise, were too easy to spot. They divided into 5 smaller groups that would travel on slightly different routes, planning to reunite at a predetermined location farther north if possible. This way, if one group was caught, the others might still escape. Evelyn found herself in a group of 7, including Moses, Clara, Ruth, Samuel, Dinah the healer, and Marcus the blacksmith. They moved with increased caution now, knowing that pursuers were close. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in caves, dense thickets, or abandoned structures. They ate sparingly, stretching their meager supplies and supplementing them with berries, roots, and whatever small game Marcus could trap. On the 5th day after leaving the plantation, they had their closest call with capture. They were resting in a dense stand of trees when they heard dogs in the distance. The sound was unmistakable, hounds baying as they picked up a scent, followed by the shouts of men urging them on. The group froze, every person holding their breath, praying that the dogs would pass by without detecting them. The sounds grew closer, close enough that they could hear individual voices shouting commands. Marcus quietly readied a large stick, preparing to fight if necessary. Evelyn's hand went to the knife she had taken from the Whitmore kitchen, a small blade that would be almost useless against armed men, but which gave her some slight sense of not being completely defenseless. Then, miraculously, the sounds began to recede. The dogs had picked up a different scent, or been directed down a different path. The pursuers moved away, their voices fading into the distance. The group remained frozen for another hour, not daring to move or speak, before finally allowing themselves to breathe normally again. That night, as they continued their journey, Moses spoke words that captured what everyone was feeling. "We're ghosts now," he said, "moving through a world that wants to catch us and chain us, but we're slipping through their fingers like smoke. Every day we stay free is a victory. Every mile we travel is a prayer answered." By the end of the first week, Evelyn's group had covered nearly 80 miles. They were exhausted, hungry, their clothes in tatters, their bodies covered in scratches and insect bites. But they were still free, still moving, still clinging to the hope that had driven them to run in the first place. They had passed beyond the immediate area of the Whitmore plantation and were now traveling through territory where their specific identities might not be known, where they were just nameless runaways rather than the specific people who had escaped from the Whitmore estate. They began to encounter signs of the war that had seemed so distant when they were enslaved. They passed through areas where Confederate troops had recently camped, seeing the remains of campfires and discarded equipment. They heard distant artillery fire from battles being fought to the east. They saw farms abandoned or destroyed, crops rotting in fields because there was no one left to harvest them, houses burned by one army or the other. The landscape itself told the story of a society tearing itself apart, and within that chaos, they found opportunities. They raided abandoned farmhouses for food and supplies. They encountered other escaped slaves who shared information about routes and dangers. They even received help from a few brave souls, both black and white, who were willing to risk their own safety to aid fugitives seeking freedom. On the 10th day after leaving the plantation, they crossed into Arkansas. The border meant little in practical terms. Slavery existed on both sides, and danger remained constant. But psychologically it felt significant, as if they had passed from one chapter of their journey into another. They were now in territory where Union forces were known to be operating, where the possibility of reaching actual freedom was becoming more tangible. It was here that they finally received solid information about where the Union lines actually were. An elderly black man who lived in a small cabin miles from any town told them that federal troops were operating about 60 miles to the northeast, that they had established camps and were accepting escaped slaves who made it to their lines. He drew them a rough map in the dirt, showing landmarks and safe routes, warning them about areas where Confederate patrols were known to operate. "You're close now," the old man said. "Closer than you think, but these last miles might be the hardest. The Confederates know slaves are running toward Union lines, so they watch those approaches carefully. You'll need to be smart, need to be careful, need to be lucky." Armed with this information, Evelyn's group pushed forward with renewed energy despite their exhaustion. 60 miles. It seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. 60 miles between slavery and freedom, between the past and the future, between who they had been forced to be and who they might choose to become. They traveled for 3 more days, moving with extreme caution through territory that was increasingly militarized. They saw Confederate patrols and hid in ditches until they passed. They heard the sounds of skirmishes in the distance and detoured around them. They moved through a landscape scarred by war, where the old order was visibly crumbling, but where danger remained at every turn. On the 13th day after leaving the Whitmore plantation, as dawn was breaking over a ridge of hills, they saw something that made their hearts leap. The flag of the United States flying over a distant encampment, the Union lines. After nearly 2 weeks of constant travel, of fear and exhaustion and determination, they had reached their destination. They approached cautiously, still half afraid that it might be a trap or a mirage. But as they drew closer, they could see Union soldiers, men in blue uniforms who watched them approach with curiosity rather than hostility. When they finally walked into the camp, announcing that they were escaped slaves seeking freedom, they were greeted not with chains but with food, water, and the simple acknowledgement of their humanity. A Union officer took their names and their stories, writing everything down in a careful record. When he came to Evelyn, she spoke her name clearly and added something else. "I am Evelyn of Texas. I was enslaved on the Whitmore plantation for 14 years. Before I escaped, I gave my mistress 10 lashes at the same tree where she had me whipped. I want that written down. I want it remembered." The officer paused, his pen hovering over the paper, then nodded slowly and wrote it all down. "It will be remembered," he said. "I'll make sure of it." In the days that followed, Evelyn learned that 4 of the 5 groups that had split off from the main escape party had made it to Union lines. 31 of the original 37 people who had fled the Whitmore plantation and neighboring estates had successfully escaped. 6 had been recaptured or had died during the journey, their names added to the countless other casualties of a system built on human bondage. Moses was among those who had made it, as were Clara, Ruth, Samuel, Dinah, and Marcus. They had all survived the journey, though they bore the physical and psychological scars of both their years in slavery and their desperate flight to freedom. They were placed in a contraband camp, the term used for escaped slaves who had reached Union lines, where they would work for wages, receive basic education, and begin the long process of building new lives. Evelyn's story spread through the camp and beyond. The tale of the slave woman who had whipped her mistress before escaping became a powerful symbol of resistance and justice. It was repeated in slave quarters throughout the region, carried by the invisible networks of communication that connected enslaved communities. Some versions of the story were exaggerated. In some tellings, Evelyn had beaten Margaret nearly to death, or had rallied all the slaves on the plantation to rise up in rebellion. But the core truth remained. A woman who had been powerless had seized power, if only for a moment, and had lived to tell the tale. Margaret Whitmore survived her whipping, though she never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of being bound and beaten by someone she had considered her property. According to reports that filtered through to Evelyn months later, Margaret had become increasingly unbalanced after the incident, jumping at shadows and refusing to be alone with any of the remaining slaves. When Union forces eventually reached eastern Texas and the institution of slavery finally collapsed, Margaret fled to relatives in Georgia, leaving behind the plantation that had been her kingdom. Charles Whitmore returned from settling his brother's affairs to find his plantation in chaos, his wife traumatized, and a significant portion of his slave labor force gone. He attempted to maintain operations, but the combination of war, escape, and eventual emancipation destroyed the economic foundation of his enterprise. The Whitmore plantation, which had seemed so permanent and powerful, was swept away by the currents of history like a house built on sand. Evelyn spent the remaining years of the Civil War in various contraband camps and later in communities of newly freed people. She learned to write as well as read, becoming a teacher for children who had been born into slavery and needed education to navigate their new reality as free citizens. She never married, never had children of her own, but she became a mother figure to dozens of young people who called her Miss Evelyn and came to her for advice and guidance. In the years after the war, during the brief period of Reconstruction, when Black Americans had some measure of political power and legal protection, Evelyn gave testimony about her experiences in slavery. She spoke at churches and community meetings, telling her story not as a tale of personal revenge, but as an example of resistance and the fundamental human dignity that no system of oppression could completely extinguish. She always emphasized the same points, that what she had done to Margaret Whitmore was not primarily about revenge, but about forcing one person who had wielded absolute power over others to understand, even briefly, what it felt like to be powerless. That the whipping was a reversal of unjust power, a symbolic act that pointed toward the larger justice that needed to be achieved in society. That true freedom required not just the end of slavery, but the creation of a new social order built on equality and mutual respect. Evelyn lived to be 67 years old, dying in 1898, 35 years after her escape from the Whitmore plantation. She spent those decades working for the advancement of her community, teaching, organizing, and preserving the stories of those who had suffered under slavery and fought for freedom. She never forgot the names of those who had died in bondage, who had been sold away, who had been whipped at the tree. She carried their memories with her and told their stories so that they would not be lost to history. The whipping tree on the Whitmore plantation still stood decades after the end of slavery, a silent witness to both the cruelty of the past and the resistance that had ultimately overcome it. It became something of a landmark in the area, and people would point it out to visitors with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said the tree was cursed, that it would never bear leaves again after what it had witnessed. Others said it was blessed, a monument to the strength of those who had suffered there and survived. Evelyn's story, like so many stories from the era of slavery and the Civil War, was eventually forgotten by the broader culture, buried under the weight of lost cause mythology and national amnesia about the realities of slavery. But it was preserved in the oral traditions of Black communities, passed down through generations as a reminder that resistance was possible, that justice could sometimes be achieved even in the most unjust circumstances, that the human spirit could not be completely broken, no matter how brutal the oppression. In recent years, historians have begun to recover stories like Evelyn's to document the countless acts of resistance and rebellion that challenged the institution of slavery. These stories reveal a truth that was long obscured, that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation, that they fought for freedom in ways both large and small, and that the end of slavery was not simply the result of white political decisions, but the culmination of generations of black resistance and struggle. Evelyn's act of whipping Margaret Whitmore at the same tree where she herself had been whipped stands as a powerful symbol of that resistance. It was an act of poetic justice, a reversal of power that momentarily shattered the absolute authority that slavery had granted to white owners over black bodies. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, and yet it was also profoundly necessary. Necessary for Evelyn's own sense of self and dignity, necessary as an example to others who were deciding whether to accept their bondage or fight for freedom. The story reminds us that justice is not always delivered through official channels or legal systems. Sometimes justice comes from the oppressed themselves, from those who refuse to accept that might makes right, who insist on their own humanity, even when society tells them they are less than human. Evelyn's whipping of Margaret Whitmore was not sanctioned by any court or law, but it carried a moral authority that came from the fundamental wrongness of the system it challenged. As we reflect on this story more than 160 years after these events, it challenges us to think about justice, power, and resistance in our own time. It asks us to consider what we would do in the face of absolute injustice, whether we would choose safety through submission or risk through resistance. It reminds us that the comfortable narratives we tell about history often obscure the harder truths about how change actually happens, how freedom is actually won. Evelyn of Texas, the slave woman who whipped her mistress on the same tree of her pain, deserves to be remembered not as an aberration or an exception, but as one example among thousands of people who refuse to accept their designated place in an unjust hierarchy. Her story is part of the larger story of how slavery was challenged and eventually destroyed, how a nation was forced to confront the contradiction between its stated ideals of freedom and the reality of human bondage. In the end, Evelyn's greatest victory was not the whipping itself, but the fact that she escaped to freedom, lived a long life, and was able to tell her own story in her own words. She went from being property to being a person with legal rights, from being silenced to being a teacher and speaker, from being powerless to being an agent of change in her community. The whipping was one moment in a much longer journey, but it was a moment that defined her, that showed both to herself and to others that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance was possible. If you found Evelyn's story of courage and resistance moving and important, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you more untold stories from history that challenge us to think differently about the past and its continuing relevance to our present. And please comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of history enthusiasts. Your support helps us continue this work of recovering and sharing these powerful narratives that deserve to be remembered and honored. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.